So thank you everybody for being here. It's been an exciting few days at OSFF in 2024. As exciting as it is, it's mutually exhausting. There's so many projects, there's so many ideas, and you think to yourself, how can you incorporate what's out there versus how can I contribute? How can I bring it into my organization? The interesting thing today about COM is this is something that applies to every item in the FINOS portfolio. This applies to every item that we see in multiple industries. So COM is a product that enables control, measurement, and accountability of architecture practices. How do we unlock capabilities for our business partners and our clients? It's going to get hot in here. But before we begin, I think it's been a long 36 hours, as Mal pointed out. Everybody stand up. You have to stand up. Let's move. Let's get the wiggles out a little bit. We can do it. It's a little bit awkward. While you're up, I want to see a show of hands. Who has heard of architecture as code? Who here has? That's great. Who here has seen it in practice or is actually applying it in their day-to-day? Awesome. So now that we're up, we're ready, we're set, let's go. Who do we have here today? Myself. My name is Denis Coffaro, and I'm here with David Johnston from Red Hat. I'm an enterprise architect at Morgan Stanley. What's unique about the enterprise architecture practice at Morgan Stanley, it's a horizontal across the firm. This gives me an opportunity to look into different landscapes and different aspects of different divisions and departments across the board. David today joins us from Red Hat, as we said, where he's a solution architect in the FSI vertical. He's positioned with a similar insight where he has hands-on, ground floor, day-to-day issues and challenges that he sees, and how does he see this map up into organizational challenges at the boardroom level. I came across David at a David and Red Hat at a meeting, I think it was in April of 2024, where we started to really talk about COM. What are we trying to do? What's the problem? And kind of unwrapping and getting our hands around it. In those discussions, we kind of quickly realized that we were both sitting and saying the same things from different perspectives and angles. So one of the things I think we want to take a step back at, because we've had a lot of momentum with COM over the past year, is the problem statement. What are we solving? What is the issue out there that we see? And the biggest challenge that we see is architecture decisions and tensions are misaligned to deployments. What we do in planning sessions, what we do in whiteboards, what we do with maintaining and managing artifacts through architecture, after your initial deploy, there's a lot of synergy, there's a lot of alignment. What we start to see happen over time is as features comes in, bug fix issues come in, you start to drift a bit. And to be fair, it's not an intentional drift. It's usually a drift that's based on client feedback, features, and the product itself evolving. What do we need to really help and hone in on this? So we kind of talk about the 5 principles that I have on the screen. One of them is a common framework. All of us see in our day-to-day that each product and team creates artifacts independently of one another. Within the same organization, if you look and you poll a lot of the governance chapters, a lot of the policies and the practices, each department, division, organization, sometimes even product line, they have their own way of doing it, have their own way of documenting things, their own way of adding their uniqueness to the mix. We need this common framework. This is important. These are table stakes for us to do anything downstream. The second piece is that framework needs to be simple and extendable. It's a little bit of an oxymoron and it's a little bit of a challenge. Quite often if something is extendable, it's not simple. And if it's simple, you can't extend it. These are notions that we live with on a day-to-day. And what this isn't about creating a prescriptive model with properties and attributes. This is about creating the scaffolding to allow organizations to come in and add what they see fit. And we'll talk a little bit later down the road in the presentation about domains and how do domains enable us to do things. Regulatory and control enabled. All of the organizations in every way or another have internal, external policies that are controls. Whether these are internal, whether they're external, they need to be managed. They need to be managed with attention to detail, and there needs to be accountability around those. This is something that's near and dear when we think about what we're doing on a day-to-day in our industry. It's not just about coming out with, this is a pristine product, this has the best architecture practice, we're using the best components, we're using the best authentication type, authorization model. The question is, are we meeting those external and internal standards? We get a little bit more mature into the product, and what do we see? We talk about reuse in patterns and bundles. If a product or a team goes through an architecture process and maps it through deployment, how can we capture that? How can we capture those components? How do we capture the intentions? And building those components to build a bundle or a pattern. It's something you'll hear David talk a little bit about efficiency in the field and how can this help us bridge clients together. And last but not least is the automation enabler. I think for a long time, we've done significant amount of automation in different fields. Where we start to fall short is where we don't have that common framework. We start deviating from the model and start adding the conditional clauses. Maybe I'm going to consume it from here. If it's not available, I'm going to go there. Having this type of framework together that's simple, extendable, and it's regulatory conscious is critical. And these are the properties that we think are going to help us bridge that gap from the design through implementation. So who are we solving this for is the second piece to the question. This was a problem that we thought about with a bunch of colleagues that casually talking, and then we quickly realized this wasn't really specific to a certain industry. We had the offsite where I talk about Red Hat and some of the partners that we had there. And this kind of exposed the problem that this really wasn't just a financial services problem. This is an industry standard problem. And when we look at that being industry agnostic, drove a little bit deeper into it, we started to see, well, our partners or vendors and us as in FSI, we both have the same problem. So now we started to see and uncover, this is a dual-sided market. There's a great opportunity here for the consumers to contribute and the contributors to consume it. So this really factored into how can we increase the velocity of what we're trying to do, time to market, delivery at the product level. So talked a little bit earlier about architecture and practices, and it's more than just getting what the client wants. A lot of it is policy, a lot of it's security, a lot of it's regulatory governance and accountability. How do we incorporate those into domains, and how do we keep it across multiple horizontals and verticals in every organization? I think what also was interesting when we were meeting in the offsite in early 2024 is I think of FINRA, SEC, FFIC. These are governing bodies I live with. But then we had our healthcare colleagues that were talking about HIPAA. In vehicle manufacturing, it's NHTSA. And in pharmaceuticals, it's the FDA. So it's not a unique challenge to us. So this gives us a massive opportunity to solve this in a bigger scale. Transition a bit. So how are we solving this problem? And on this slide, there's going to be a lot of content. And to be fair, the words, we'll look at a visualization a little bit later, but the words are really more for the reader opposed to you guys in the room today. It is a structured data model framework. It's a structured document. It's a way that we can create, we can manage, and we can maintain it. This is important because this provides control, this provides measurability, this provides us productivity along the way, and most importantly is accountability, right? So we spent a huge amount of time in 2024 on this schema in the core. But as we start to branch out a little bit, we start to uncover and work outwards, and we start working towards a productivity suite. What is a productivity suite? This is what we expose to clients to consume that data model. Today we have translation engines that go between well-known formats. We have CLIs that you can go and you can spawn an image, preliminary and fairly fundamental, but a visualization of what does that model have today. Some custom validators at the data model level, and frameworks and scaffolding again for a UI. And then we kind of look into the domains that surround this. And what are the domains? The domains are where you bring yourself to the model. The domains are where you bring your subject matter expertise. I'm going to talk a little bit about resiliency and a resiliency example later in the presentation, but earlier yesterday, Eva and Aldwin talked and gave a very detailed presentation on the security domain. And in there you can see how they bring themselves, they bring their best practices, their policies, their alignment to their regulations together. Because at the core, to make it scalable, to make it usable and flexible, it has to be able to appreciate and to consume perspectives from different people. So the domains are really bringing it together. I'm going to stop here because I think this for a moment, this visualization kind of puts into context what we were talking about earlier. We're the only presentation in FINOS this year with a pointer. David, thank you. It's a great, I'm going to use it excessively. So what do we have? We have the schema. This is where we spent a lot of time last year. This is where you start to see in our meetings that we have monthly, you start to see us talking about the JSON, the schema itself, the extension, the custom vocabulary, a lot of the frameworks and scaffolding around it. The productivity suite is a CLI. This is the UI. This is bringing that model to life. This is where you can touch it, you can feel it, you can start to think to yourself, how can I use it? As we go outward, is we look at the domains. And a domain is where you bring yourself as in a security-specific domain, somebody who is in resiliency, someone who's in risk. So we look at the product as 3 layers. Within those 3 layers, you can start to see how we're coming together to build this. Ultimately, the entire product itself, is driven to enable capabilities in every organization. And these are the capabilities that we want to at least present or enhance if they exist. We talk about fitness, data catalogs, drift detection. Again, drift detection is something that's near and dear to us. What was declared during an approval, is it what's running? Is it what's running in month 3, month 9, month 12? Start to look at documentation, the state analysis. The state analysis is one of those, it's one of those areas where, as a practicing architect, as an architect on a project, or wearing multiple hats, you're a data scientist, you're an architect, you're running into end-of-life programs. We have an end-of-life program on an OS. Okay, well, how can we map? Where is that OS? What's running on that OS? What are the dependencies that we have with inside the stack? Same thing goes with modernization efforts, and the same thing applies with transformation. A really good example, 2 weeks ago, a colleague was talking about an exit strategy from a city. Well, the city happened to be a strategic place of business in the past 10 years. Well, how are we going to lift and shift? What's impacted? What's the model? How do we maintain it? And how do we maintain fidelity in that analysis? Ultimately, COM here, again, we talk about the schema, the productivity seat, and the domains. The notion and the real value to organizations, small and large, is enabling these capabilities. I'm going to kind of take a moment. I'm going to pass it off to David, who's going to talk a little bit about the field, what he sees, and kind of where these things aligned over the past year in his career.
Check. Can you guys hear me in the back? Okay, awesome. All right, so I'm the field guy. I'm giving the field perspective from Red Hat, what we see. In my technology career, I started in engineering, I went into consulting, and now in solution architecture. I've really seen where these critical security review processes can cause a lot of friction with delivery teams and really slow down delivery times. They're critical, and especially in financial services, we know how critical they are for operations. These processes that the security reviews, permit to build, permit to operate, everyone's favorite thing to do, We know they're critical, but they slow down projects. The fact that there's no automation in this space also, that connects your actual design review process and the security review boards, is a major issue as well. And the design issues, the fact there's inconsistencies, they're difficult to maintain, they're disconnected from your actual source code. That causes even more friction and delivery timelines getting slowed down, which in the field is critical, especially where in our consulting delivery projects, in our POCs, we want to prove that our stuff works and we want to get it out there to you guys as fast as possible. So this is where we see Red Hat and us in the field, we're trying to brainstorm ways that we could work with COM and the architecture as code framework to speed this up and eliminate that friction. So some of the ways that we see that, Dennis talked about a lot of them, but just to summarize specifically, the structured documentation, the standardization, that'll be critical for eliminating ambiguity, and reducing the risk of misinterpretation, which also causes more project delays. And then the distributed model and the fact that it will be version controlled is absolutely critical. Everything's as code these days. And why not have your architecture designs be as well? With that comes all the benefits of as code, X as code. Traceability, enhanced collaboration across your organization. And as Dennis also said, the domain-driven architecture and automation, being able to work this right into your CI/CD pipelines, it speeds up the process, but also every step of the software delivery lifecycle, you can constantly check, continuously check, which is what we need in today's fast-moving environments. And finally, being able to embed the controls and having a visualization capability that's coming as part of the productivity suite. There's some fundamental stuff there now, but being able to actually share your architectures, easily generate them automatically, not spend time in power, like designing your own art, which we're not all good at as technologists necessarily, having it able to just automatically generate and being able to collaborate with your leadership on it. And finally, just being able to enforce the standards through the automation will be critical. Using the metadata and the controls that are embedded straight into the framework will really help. So in the end, this is going to really help with, in these risk-averse environments, like help your delivery timelines. Let me just switch over to here. I don't have any cool laser stuff to do for mine, but in the end, the result you get is productivity. So your engineering cycles will be reduced, the project timelines will be shortened. You'll also have a lower percentage of compliance violations through the automation. And in the end, your quality and traceability will be much more enhanced, which will lower the friction with your delivery teams, provide peace of mind, which is nice. But in the end, the cost savings is the most critical part. Like, it's what keeps us in the game in the end. So, and I'll pass it over to Dennis to kind of go deeper into the actual framework for a little bit. Here you go. Yep. Back behind my screen.
Okay, so we're kind of going a little bit backwards, and we're going to talk about how do we showcase a domain? What is a domain? Again, a domain is an area that usually has a thematic connection, a group of people, resiliency, security, for example. What I'm going to do here is take us through a very simple single node application, TraderX, as I'm hoping all of you are familiar with. I'm going to touch on a few parts about the data, but in reality, I don't want to focus in on the documentation. It's really the connection. It's the ideas. It's how are we tying these things together. So in here you can see, right, so, where we talk about nodes, what are nodes in general, the elements, the element of a node. It's a people. It's anything that's a people, a person, a system, a network, a device. We start to see relationships and metadata. Relationships are a way for us where we add and document our intentions. Often it's port protocol service. It may be a description of a service. For us, this is a massively important part when it comes to the visualization. Objects alone are wonderful. What really shows and adds value is where you talk about the intentions or the reality behind a connection. And then the same thing with metadata. Metadata is interesting because metadata is a little bit like an incubator for different properties of the model. We and all of us have been there and done that, where we've seen standard metadata areas where you can add arbitrary data become very big and very large because the actual core doesn't scale out that much, and before you know it, 80% of what you're working with is in these custom properties and attributes. One of the things that we found is metadata is a great way to capture the usage or the reoccurrence of a specific property. So we think of it as an incubator in a way of like, wow, as we're starting to look at some of the commits, as we're starting to work with the clients and we see everyone collectively is documenting and outlining nodes as an example, well, maybe that belongs up a tier in that level. So as we come here, we're going to talk about controls, and we're going to talk about the resiliency domain. For this example, we're going to talk about a DR plan. Virtually everybody has a DR plan. Sometimes a DR plan, there is no DR plan, right? It depends on funding. It depends on resources availability. But that still, in essence, is a plan. So for this example, we're going to talk about the resiliency domain and the DR plan. Quickly, we're going to go over control. What is a control? Controls are specific measures, process policies that help us manage risks and meet some sort of requirement. Maybe the requirement is internal, external, but that's what it means. So what we have here in the model, and can't necessarily see it that well, if you look a little bit, if you start to look here, we talk about some things that we're asking for in that model. Of those 2 or 3 properties would be, what is the amount of sites or instances that this has to be deployed to is number 1. Number 2 is the minimum distance that these sites have to maintain, right? And then part of that is, what's the way to show this? What's the evidence? What's the requirement for that? And that would be in the form of a deployment log. So the controls are the policy. What becomes interesting is when we start taking the control and we start talking about the control config. The control config is the instantiation of that policy. Where and how can we represent that? Well, with inside of the control ID, because controls, like in the model itself, will have unique IDs. There's a control ID. Inside of that mapping, you'll start to see site redundancy is 2, and site distance is 400, and the evidence type is a deployment log, right? And again, this is where you start to see what does that policy that quite often sits outside of your architecture model in some authoritative source map to what needs to be in place. Then we start to talk about evidencing it. And this is just as important as the control itself. This is just as important as the control config. So the evidence, as you see here, we can see the evidence paths and evidence in the unique ID of the evidence. And we can also start to look at the control configuration. One thing that's important here when we start talking about evidence is if it's a small amount of evidence, sometimes it's easy to bring the actual snippet from the app config or your web.doc config into here. But we do realize that sometimes evidence sits outside, right? Maybe it's in the form of a Jira ticket, maybe it's in the form of SharePoint, maybe it's in a Jive post. So we're conscious over this, and we're conscious over not being too overly prescriptive or looking to maintain and manage too much data as authoritative, and being able to reference it externally. So you'll see that in deeper examples, you'll see URI modules and URL and methods outward of the model. So when we look about COM and kind of where are we going, where are we today, I come back to this map and this image here because it's basic, but I think it's important for us as both contributors and consumers. We spend a lot of time in this schema. Now we're looking in the next quarter or 2 to move outward a bit into the productivity suite. What does that mean? A big piece is a VS Code plugin, right? I think this will really help us, again, contribute, consume, be able to visualize on demand. We look at the VS Code plugin as something that's going to help us be a springboard into the UI. A big feedback that we get from a lot of clients and consumers and partners is it would be nice to be able to derive an image from a manifest, but then also go from a manifest to an image, vice versa, back and forth. How does that look? How do we incorporate some of the other checks and balances along the way? Enhanced documentation. Last week, we one of the lead developers on it really released a big feature set on new documentation, and it's great. And I think it's important for people to kind of sit back and take a look. It's not a long read, but it's enough where it sets up what are some of the table stakes to have a conversation about COM. And then some of the non-so-exciting pieces is the hosting. Why do I say this? Because it's a question that continually gets brought up is how do I instantiate, bring COM into my environment? How do I host it? Is it centralized? Is it distributed? Am I using a schema store? Am I using an S3 bucket? A lot of the details between it. So how do we really build these up? These are features that are actively in the backlog. We're actively burning them as we sit. But again, the call for the community is any help would be massively important, right? This is where we start to take advantage of different skill sets in different domains. If we look a little bit south, we talk about the client and the contributor journey. Runways. I think runways are important. If we have someone who's a domain expert in risk, how can we do what used to be called the Pinterest model within 5 days of onboarding a developer in Pinterest if they didn't make a PR in the first 5 business days? That was the measure of productivity. How can we take someone in a domain that's very specific to them, and rightfully so in their organization, and have a ramp-up period that's very quick without inundating them with some of the inner workings, because maybe they don't need to know about the inner workings of Spectral in our schema. And maybe there are some things that they do. Again, when we start also looking at the UI, UX, how can we bring people in and out and be able to balance the feature set to what the clients want? To David's point earlier, how can we start to turn features over at a quicker rate, a quicker pace, that are crisper, tighter, and smaller for feedback? Domain discovery and campaigns. This really is the heart of where the community comes in. We're not expertise in security. We're not business architects by trade at the moment. We're not API architects. We happen to have people who are sitting on the project who live in that space to a certain degree. But I think the resiliency is a really good example of that. Wasn't done by somebody who was working on the inner part of the model. That was someone who sits in that domain, and she took that leap of faith and did the first one. So on that one, that's really important. Feedback loops. The quicker we turn over features, the quicker we get them out, the quicker we publish them, the quicker people understand how can they host it, where can they see it, where can they touch it and feel it, the quicker we get the feedback on them. Products are only as good as your client contributor feedback. We're super early in the game at that product level, but any and every is helpful, right? This is the beautiful part about the community-driven projects and products. I'm going to stop and pause a little bit now, because now we're segmenting into how are we thinking about positioning this and where and who can help. David will talk a little bit about some of the ideas that we've been talking about with inside of Red Hat and where they can help us as partners continue the development story.
Yeah, so from the Red Hat perspective, we've been joining in on the calls, the community calls, trying to bring in all different people from Red Hat from different backgrounds. So some of the ideas we've been brainstorming, where can we actually help out? Like, where do we bring value? Everyone knows Red Hat is the world's leading open source company, and we want to be able to bring that to the most exciting projects. This one helps us help our customers and also helps ourselves with our project deliveries. So validated patterns, these are battle-tested, from the field reference architectures. We think if once COM is in these validated patterns, it could be super useful for the field for getting it out there. The trusted software supply chain, it's a natural fit to have COM worked into your delivery pipelines. What more value can you have than having your actual architecture design built straight into your pipelines with attestation and everything built right in? And the GitOps is a natural fit also, and that expands to beyond just Argo CD, which Red Hat's a big contributor of, but also Helm and compliance operator and OpenShift. How do you take the evidence and actually put it into the next level of declarative into your production workloads and things like that? Backstage is also another natural fit. Red Hat's a very big contributor in this community. We're trying to see how this could potentially fit in there. It could be a really natural fit. Just what better place to do, structured documentation, visualization of your designs than right in your developer portal, where your code begins and ends. And additionally, IDE plugins, already mentioned by Dennis. Red Hat plays in this space for our own products, but we also work on container-based IDEs that this could be very valuable. A lot of different integrations could be done there. And the AI readiness space is getting really exciting right now with what they're doing with the governance framework and with what they're doing with TraderX, this could fit naturally into that. And basically, we just want to work at however we can as a partner and really help promote and bring awareness and just brainstorm with the community, like how can we all help? Like how can we make this thing more real? So.
Awesome. So, I mean, I think before we move to the conclusion, that's the common theme. We spent a year, or less actually, because we didn't know where we were going to end up, and we ended up with a really strong framework, a really strong schema. We're very passionate and proud about that because we didn't rush it. We don't want to rush it to get to the productivity suite, to the UI, to the API, to the extensions where people start to ingress and egress. We want to get that at a strong place. Now as we start to build out, the biggest things we're moving forward, to David's point, is where can we do minimal effort to get max return in a scope that serves a lot of people, and that comes from the community. So in conclusion, a lot of the questions are always, how do I get involved? So number one, we meet the last Tuesday of every month at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. The number one way to get involved is to go to the repo, sign up. If you are a FINOS member through your organization, well then you can contribute in whatever way under the policies that you have. If you're not, you can contribute. You can contribute as an individual contributor on your own time. So there's no scope of what we're trying to do here. There's no limitation. Documentation we talked about earlier, the meetings, we may move to twice a month just because of the volume of conversations that we have. We're trying to push everyone to drive those conversations to an issue. If it's a good issue, we can read it. Once again, we can measure it, we can ingest it, and we can vote on it. And that's a very important piece of it, is how often are we meeting and whatnot. But again, the notion on the information is there's no boundary. Anybody and everybody can come in at any level, at any domain, because there may be domains that we just don't know that we're aware of, right? Some cross connects that are important. My colleagues did a great job in a calm introduction in OSFF London of this year. You should definitely check that out, where they drive deep into some of the reasonings behind what we spent and invested time in at that schema and the data model. TraderX, it's a common theme in FINOS for those of us who are kind of new, and I think it's important if you check out that project, you'll see a lot of cross connects across the board. And then the last two, I think are really important because they show references to COM, right? The idea isn't just to host it with an overly prescriptive framework and you come in and you come out here. The first one is governance using architecture. This is what Rishi, a colleague of ours, demoed, and he talked about governance. He talked about business architecture and leveraging COM to enable his suite of domains. I talked earlier about the security, the straight through provisioning with Eva and Aldwin. That's another example of a really complicated domain where they started to unravel and figure out how can they quantify it and map it with inside of COM. So as we wrap everything up, the important thing is to call for actions, is to call for people to contribute ideas, thoughts, feedback in any way, shape, or form. Want to keep calm, and then use my laser one last time and contribute. We don't want you to carry on. We want you to start contributing.
Give it a spin.
Now, the most contentious part of the entire preparation of this session was this last piece. I don't like transitions at all. David loves transitions. So this is David. So
let's go. Contribute.
We have probably time for 2 questions, or maybe I want to be conscious over the wrap-up session. Are there any questions that anybody has in the audience? I'm going to look around. Yes.
Could you talk about COM in the realm of, or control in the realm of OpenShift applications, if you have a chance to think through that? Yeah.
So OpenShift, the compliance controller, and how do you see that mapping within COM? David, you could probably...
Yeah, I touched on it briefly, like in the form of GitOps, like through your Argo CD, there's an operator. Also, there's the compliance operator for OpenShift. We could see the evidence actually being put into real declarative GitOps workflows to the compliance operator, you can ensure that it's actually getting applied in a declarative state across your clusters. And that can be scaled to multi-clusters, to fleets of clusters, but yeah.
So he can talk
That's
more,
where we're thinking.
more about that. When I look at it as like, and it's been a long time with OpenShift, but imagine being able to take a piece of the deployment config and being able to map that in. It's like, here's your evidence. It's actually a snippet of the deployment, and here's where it sits today. Anything else? Yes. Right here? Yes, yeah, sure.
So how does it basically really, maps with the infrastructure, the deployment, in the real world?
Okay, so it's funny that you ask. This past week, we had a demo internally of taking an architecture as code manifest in COM and spinning up a Kubernetes cluster, namespace, resource, and an app deployment. I think maybe what we could do is I think we recorded that session. This was for something that we did for, some colleagues did for API days. So to answer your question is, this together goes with infra as code, right? And I think historically we struggled with infrastructure as code because there was always the disconnection of the application and the architecture. So this is step one about bringing those together and bridging those areas. I think you had a question as well? Yes.
Yeah, so I worked on architecture as code as well previously. And one of the challenges was taking an existing application that's running somewhere and sort of applying it. It sort of works well for greenfield. Have you tried applying it to existing applications? How many candidates?
This was something else that was demoed recently internally, is going to a repo and be able to scan the repo and come out with a visualization. What does that look like? In that example, we use COM, but we also use C4. So you're able to break it down with the components of containers, not the code per se. And I think where the example, it was Java Spring and they were using some of the metadata properties on it. And it was a lot easier in that way. But yes, that's the idea, is can you go to the repo, because that's the source of truth. That's even before it's built, and then work backwards. So the Terraform's an orchestration engine, just like Ansible per se, right? And we look at whether it's Terraform, Ansible, or a Puppet, is that would be a domain in and of itself. So how can that infra team together then figure out, okay, of this app profile of what they have, how can we create that in a structured document? That then ties back to patterns where applicable, and then you'd be able to make that more mass use. But that also ties into the infra as code question, is how do you take the architecture that's done up front and map it to deployments? Right? So we don't have a formal answer now, and I think that's important. So what I'll look for you tomorrow is to open an issue, and we'll be sure to front run it. But thank you. Thank you, folks.
Thanks, all.